Welcome to the December Colloquium. This is the last, good evening. This is the last lecture of the semester. And my name is Linda Vita, and I'm the head of the Water Resources Center Archives. We're the major sponsor of the Colloquium series, and I just have a few announcements to make. One is that we just published our 2007 calendar with the Transportation Library, and it's a water theme. So it has to do with the photos have to do with the infrastructure of bringing water from the Sierra to the Bay Area. So the photos are from SFPUC, San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, and the East Bay Mud. So I think we have some order forms in the back if you're interested. Another thing is I'd like to let you know that next semester we have the following speakers. February, Steve Ritchie, who's going to talk about the Cargill Salt Pond restoration. And in March, Lynn Ingram, who's going to talk about the geological history of the Bay. In April, Ellen Hannock, who's from the Public Policy Institute of California, going to talk about the Bay Delta and a new report that should be out by then. And then May 1st, Pat Mulroy, who's a general manager of Southern Nevada Water Authority, so that's Las Vegas, so that should be very interesting. And another change, a change for next semester is we are going to be in this same room for the lectures, and the lecture will start at the same time. However, we are not going to have a reception at the archives beforehand, and we're going to bring the speakers here to the room around earlier so that if anybody wants to meet the speaker, they can meet the speaker here. So I think that's it for the announcements, and then Professor Narasimhan will introduce our speaker.
I start this introduction today with a sort of a heavy heart. This colloquium has been supported both intellectually and financially by the deans throughout this campus, as well as the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which is also part of this family of this university. And at the lab, the Earth Science Division has had the most direct connection to what we do in this colloquium. And the director of that division, a young man from Iceland, his name Bodvarsson, Gudmundur Svavar Bodvarsson, 54 years old, full of vibrant energy. All of a sudden, 10 days ago, we came to know that he passed away. As I start this, I cannot tell you how enthusiastically that he was supporting this venture, and it will continue to be supported by the division. So we had a memorial service for him this afternoon in a church in Berkeley, North Berkeley. And we just came from there. And so we very fondly remember Bo not only as a scientist, but also a fantastic human being. Now to introduce today's speaker. In this colloquium, we have always tried to bring people who are knowledgeable about water from various walks of life, not just the university and the academia, but all walks of life. And for the first time, we have here a speaker who is a journalist. And the journalists look at the world somewhat differently from what we do. They go and talk to a lot of people, gather a lot of information, and form their own perceptions. And their perceptions is as valid as anybody else's perception. So we have a journalist. Several months ago, I saw in the local newspaper, Contra Costa Times, a series of front-page articles about California's water. I found them to be very informative and understandable. So I got together with our committee members and suggested whether we could have this journalist come and talk to us. Everybody thought it was a good idea. And so here is Mike Taugher. Mike got his bachelor's degree in English from UC Santa Barbara. Then he found his niche in being a journalist dealing with environmental issues, and started in New Mexico and Colorado, two water important states, and then he finally came to California. And so he has been, of late, writing a number of articles about not only the San Joaquin Valley, but also the Bay, the politics of it, the science of it, the economics of it, and so forth. And he's going to brief us today about some of the latest developments that are going on with reference to California water. He has been doing a lot of snooping, and so he will introduce us to some of the latest information. Mike?
Can you hear me? Yeah. My name's Mike Taugher, as you just heard, and I cover the environment for the Contra Costa Times. I tend to focus on natural resources. I write about land issues, air issues, energy, wildlife, but a lot about water. The Delta is kind of right in our backyard, and that's a good way to get an editor interested. I can say, hey, these things are happening right here, and they affect us. And the Delta is obviously a resource of pretty large statewide importance. And I'm going to talk about politics and science and some other stuff. And I just want to make a disclaimer right up front that I'm not a scientist and I'm not a politician. I'm a reporter. And so the way I see my job is I kind of go out and I try to investigate different things, analyze them, synthesize them, and try to present them in a way that's interesting and readable for the general public. And hopefully they can make up their own minds about these things. I try to keep my opinions out of it as best I can. I think I'm successful in that, but when I'm not, I hear about it. I thought I'd talk today about what's wrong in the Delta and why I think that's important. Talk about what scientists think might be causing the problems out there. Real briefly, I was going to talk a little bit about how we got here. And then finally, I want to wrap up with where we go from here. I think 2007 is probably going to be a really interesting year for the Delta and for California water. So how's the Delta doing? That was our front page on Christmas Day last year. And, and it was the start of a 6-part series on the Delta and California water. And you heard about there was a media war on Christmas, I guess, last year. And I'm not sure what that was about, but I think I got caught up in it. And the reaction I got from readers was really gratifying. I got dozens and dozens of phone calls and emails and letters and things. And most of them were very appreciative. There were people that really wanted to know about what was happening in the Delta. And then I got some other letters too. One of my favorites was the very first email that I got on Christmas Day. The subject line is, Merry Dying Christmas to you too. And the email was, I got up this morning, and I got this email on Christmas morning, I'm not waging war, I like Christmas myself. But I got up this morning and went out to get the paper so I could sit down, enjoy a cup of coffee, and look forward to spending the day with my family and friends. I opened the Sunday Times to the worst front page I've ever seen on a day like today. What low-class, low-life first words to see on Christmas. Heck, it's just a bad way to start any day. And she goes on and on and says that this is tasteless, and then she says, get your head out of your dark side and have a little class, and otherwise I hope you have a happy dying holidays. So we get reaction from all kinds, and but that was the first one I got, and I have to say after that, the reaction I got was great. I mean, people were really nice to me after that one. Just so we have a common baseline, in case you don't know, here's the delta. And I know most of you probably are pretty familiar with this, but basically the delta is, roughly triangular shaped. On the west, it's Pittsburgh and Antioch. In the south, the point is Tracy. The north is Sacramento. If you're driving north on the Benicia Bridge and you look off to the east, on a clear day, you can be looking up past Suisun Bay here and into maybe a little bit of the delta. If you're going north and south between Stockton and Sacramento on I-5 and you look to the west, you're looking out into the delta. Basically, this was a big marsh at one time. If you think about it, all the water, all the snow melt out of the Sierra and all the water that comes out of the rivers flows out. It's got to get out the Golden Gate. It comes through the delta, Suisun Bay, San Francisco Bay, and out into the ocean. And this was the big, it was just a big marsh at one time. And then around the time of the gold rush, farmers went out there and they started kind of pushing back some land so they could farm the dry land behind that. They'd push up some berms, farm behind it. As time went on, their land would subside. It was oxidized, it would settle out, it would get blown by the wind. And today, there are a lot of bowls out there. There are about 70 of these bowls that can be 20, 25 feet below the level of the water around them. And the important thing is that those levees, those berms that they pushed up, just got bigger and bigger. They kept pushing more and more dirt on them. And so that now you have these 70 bowls of varying depths throughout this area, protected by these levees that are, as they say, dirt piled upon dirt. And why that's important for the state's water supply is that if a levee breaks somewhere and the water starts rushing in, it can have enough of a suction effect to bring salt water from the direction of the ocean, from Suisun Bay, San Francisco Bay, into here. And those aren't very strong levees. Okay. So when you're a reporter and you go to your editor and you say, man, the delta is dying, it's just a disaster out there, his first question is, well, who cares? So what? And I think people should care. First of all, it's a source of drinking water for 23 million Californians. That's about 2/3 of the population of the state of California. And it's about 7.5%, a little bit more than that, of, if there are 300 million Americans, more than 7% of Americans get at least some of their drinking water out of the delta. That's a lot of people. It's the only source of tap water for 500,000 people in the Contra Costa Water District, which is central and east Contra Costa County. And I will be corrected if I'm wrong, but the Contra Costa Water District is particularly interested in the delta, not only because all of its water comes out of the delta, but its intakes are kind of at the end of the line, the farthest downstream, meaning that basically, all the other outfalls that are upstream have the potential to impact this water district's water. It's also, because it's the farthest downstream, it's the closest to the ocean, so it's the most sensitive to seawater intrusion when that occurs, or to just general salinity. And then finally, whenever you talk about the delta, everybody talks about, it's those farmers in the San Joaquin Valley and Southern California and Los Angeles, which is true. I mean, the delta supplies a lot of water to the San Joaquin Valley and to Los Angeles. But a lot of the Bay Area, I think roughly 1/3 of the Bay Area's water supply, I've heard, comes out of the delta. About The Santa Clara Water Agency, I think they get about half of their water out of the Delta, and some other East Bay districts also get Delta water. Contra Costa is unique, though, because they're getting all of it from out of the Delta. There's also the San Joaquin Valley is one of the richest agricultural regions in the world, and they get their water out of the Delta. And unfortunately, I didn't have a picture of so I was kind of stuck with that picture, sorry. And there's also a local recreational economy. There's a lot of people that boat out there, fish out there. Here's a boat throwing up some water behind it. The Delta is also the largest estuary on the west coast of the Americas. It's habitat for hundreds of species. It's a stop on the Pacific Flyway, so the birds that fly north and south along the Pacific coast, they stop in the Delta. And it's important for salmon. If you think about it, I mean, if there's one way for water to get from the Sierras down the rivers and out to the ocean through the Golden Gate, there's only one way for salmon to get back upstream. They got to swim through the Golden Gate if they're going to spawn in the Central Valley or the Sierra. They come through the Golden Gate, Sassoon Marsh, the Delta, and upstream into the rivers to lay their eggs, and the juvenile salmon come back down. So that series that we started on Christmas last year basically looked at, the heart of the series looked at 4 pillars of something that's called CalFed, which was the, I know most of you are or at least some of you are familiar with CalFed, but the CalFed was designed to improve the ecosystem, water quality, levees, and water supply. And through talking to a lot of people and reading reports and doing what reporters do, we sort of concluded that CalFed was falling short, at least so far, in each of those 4 areas. And why do we conclude that? Well, first of all, ecosystem was an easy one. The fish populations in the Delta are not doing so good. I'll talk more about that. Water quality is worse, at least in the fall. Levees, well, they're pretty fragile, and in fact, they're more fragile than the ones in New Orleans. And water supply, that's a long story, right? I mean, that's the perpetual story in California. It's very slow moving, but not a whole lot's happened. There's been some groundwater programs and some other things, but nothing real big. All right, so as I said, the ecosystem was the easiest call. It's clearly doing very badly. And what happened here is and this is a graphic from a story that we did in May last year. What happened here is, well, I should back up. State Fish and Game has been out there surveying fish populations in the Delta for decades. They have a lot of data. And what happened in January of 2005 is they looked at their data and they said, Houston, we have a problem. And the reason for that was that the pelagic fish, basically the fish that live in the open water of the Delta, not the fish that live on the bottom, not the ones that live on the shore, not the ones that migrate through, but the fish that live out in the open water of the Delta, the pelagic species, were all in a significant decline, a significant and unexplained decline. When they gather all of this, through these surveys, they knew that fish populations go up and down. Some will go up, some will go down, and if they go down, sometimes they'll know why. I mean, all the fish populations are suffering. Well, there's a drought. That's the reason for it. What was alarming in this case was that they were all going down, none of them were going up, and they couldn't explain it. They had no idea. There's nothing that was obvious that could be that could explain it. And they had 3 years of data to back it up. They said they basically didn't say a whole lot in 2002, after the 2002, 2003, 2004 data was available, but actually when the 2004 data became available, they had their 3rd year, and they they sounded the alarm, said that the delta was in a big trouble. Levees, this was June 3rd, 2004. Jones Tract, which is this area in here is a farming area. This levee that was protecting it just collapsed. It was a dry day. There was no rain, no snow, not a particularly high flow of water going. I think that's Old River, right? I think that was Old River. It was a high tide, and this just collapsed, it just failed. Nobody knows exactly why, but because the evidence all got washed away, but smart money is that it was rodent burrows that weakened the levee. That's about 300 feet, I think, about the size of a football field. You can see people and cars all on here. And it just collapsed. And what happened was, as I was saying before, when the water starts rushing into this island, there's a threat of water being sucked up from the direction of the ocean and bringing salt towards the intakes where the water supply is, which obviously nobody wants. So to alleviate that problem, the state and the federal governments shut off their pumps temporarily because as this suction was created with the water pouring into the Jones Tract, if they're sucking water out of those pumps, you're just exacerbating the problem. So they shut off the pumps temporarily, released some water from the reservoirs upstream to kind of push that seawater back, and averted a big problem. They were lucky because the water was not that salty that day. Had it been maybe in a drier year or later in the year, and this water, had it been saltier, it would have been a bigger problem, but it wasn't, and things were back to normal later. A guy named Jeff Mount and Robert Twist, a couple of scientists, they did a paper not too long, I think it was before Jones Tract, where they calculated that because the delta's the fragility of the levees, the threat of earthquakes, probability of earthquakes, the increasing pressure on the levees from climate change with higher sea level, that kind of thing. They calculated there's a 2 in 3 chance of catastrophic levee failure sometimes in the next 50 years. The implication of that is that they contend that this system of delivering water through California isn't sustainable. There's a 2 in 3 chance of catastrophic levee failures in the next 50 years. That's a picture of it flooding. Here they're repairing it. Jones Tract's been flooded at this point, and these guys are putting rocks down. I think my understanding is there's only one company in the Delta that does this, Dutra, and if there were multiple failures, there's a question as to how well they'd be able to, how expeditiously they'd be able to, fix them. That's just a graphic of. I just wanted to kind of make the point that these things are dirt. And if you think about it, I mean, the land, a farm might be down in here, and so you got water. Water's obviously heavy. It's pushing here. You've got rodent burrows and things here. Just wanted to kind of reinforce that. Okay, like I was saying, the Contra Costa Water District pays a lot of attention to water quality. It's really important to them for the reasons I already mentioned. And they came up with some interesting information last year. And if you look at this, what Contra Costa came up with is, if you look at the pink bars, that's salinity in the western delta, in dry years, normal years, and wet years. A lot of salt in dry years, less in normal years, and even less in wet years. And that makes a lot of sense because in a dry year, there's not a lot of water flowing downstream to push the seawater back. So the seawater kind of gets deeper into the delta. And in a wet year, there's a lot of flow, a lot of snowmelt, a lot of rain pushing that seawater back. So there's less salt in the delta. Makes perfect sense. What they found at the Water District was that in dry years, it was just a little bit less salty in the fall. This is all in the fall. But what was really interesting, and turns out to be pretty important, is that in normal years, it's about as salty in the fall as it is in dry years. In other words, if you live in the delta, normal years look like drought years. And in wet years, it was also saltier. And that turns out to be really important. I'll explain why in a little bit. But what changed? Well, in 1993, in the early 90s, there was a lot of problems with the salmon. And the decision was made to slow down the pumping in the spring. At the time, the state and federal water projects were moving a lot of water out of the delta in the spring. And because there's a lot of water in the delta, a lot of water coming off the mountains at that time. So they're pumping them like gangbusters in the spring. The decision was made to protect the salmon. Let's curtail the pumping in the springtime. To make up for that loss of water, the water that they weren't getting in the spring, they started pumping in the fall and drove the salt levels up. Right? Okay. And then the fourth kind of leg of that series was, again, kind of the perpetual story in California. How are we going to get more water and quench our thirst? And as I said, it's hard to be critical, I think, of CalFed on this count because it's just a slow-moving story. I mean, people have been fighting about water in California forever, and it's not going to stop. But we talked a little bit about that. The most obvious problem in the Delta, and the most immediate issue, is what's killing all those fish. Now, in January 2005, when the scientists at Fish and Game started reporting that they had all this crisis that was ongoing, they were pretty clear we can't explain that. But pretty much immediately, there was the consensus seemed to be that the places where they were likely to find what the problems were in these three categories. There's these big pumps that move all that water out of the delta. Are they causing the problem? Is it toxic substances? I mean, the San Joaquin Valley is a huge agricultural area. They use pesticides. Central Valley is also growing. There's a lot of houses going up. People using lawn fertilizer and stuff. There's just a lot of runoff that gets into that watershed and makes its way in the delta. So maybe that was causing the problem. And then finally, there was a suspicion that maybe it was invasive species. A lot of times when you have an ecological crisis, it's an invasive species that is at the root of it. And today, they've spent, I don't know exactly how much, but it's on the order of $6 or $7 million, about 16, 18 months. They got a lot of pretty interesting information together. But best I can tell, the scientists involved haven't ruled any of these really out. They've gotten a lot closer to a final answer, but some combination of these things, probably more the pumps and species than toxics at this point, best I can tell. Okay, remember I was talking about the Contra Costa Water District's findings on water quality. That comes back into play here. One of the most interesting theories is something that they came up with after they found those water quality problems. This is called the overbite clam, or Corbula amurensis. And this was discovered in Suisun Bay by Diablo Valley College students in 1986. The thinking is that it came from in ship ballast, from somewhere in Asia. What happens is, a ship's in a port, they'll take on water, stabilize the ship, cruise across the ocean, they get into San Francisco Bay or wherever they're going, dump the ballast water, and sometimes biological invaders are in that water. And that's apparently what happened here. And these guys are pretty interesting. They grow unbelievably dense. I've read that you can have tens of thousands of these in a square meter of water, a square meter, and tens of thousands of these little guys. And they're very prodigious filter feeders. I also read that, and the numbers, I'm not exactly sure about these numbers, but as I recall, in a bed like that with a water column, water 8 to 10 feet high over them, they can filter that water column out like maybe 4 times in a day. They just cleanse the water pretty good, and they eat these the younger forms of these copepods that are important food source for all those fish that are collapsing. So Contra Costa's theory, as I understand it, is that the increased salinity in the fall allowed these guys to spread more thoroughly throughout the delta, and that they're basically undercutting the food web by eating the food that all these fish need. Some of the scientists on these teams, they haven't completely bought off on this yet, but nobody dismisses this. From what best I can tell, everybody's saying that's a pretty good theory. It probably doesn't explain the whole thing, at least not yet. But it's a pretty interesting thing. One of the cool things about being a reporter, sometimes you get to see stuff that and go places that not everybody gets to go. This is the fish salvage facility that's associated with the state water pumps. And I'd been here a couple of times in the past, kind of on these official tours. And I called Department of Water Resources and said, hey, I want to go back out there again to get some photos and freshen my mind for the stories that we're writing about the Delta. And they said, sure, go on out. And I get out there, and instead of having the regular tour, these guys, the 2 guys manning the place, just let us in. And I happened to get there. What they do is they sample these water. They sample the water every 2 hours and count the number of fish that they find in there, and then extrapolate from that how many fish are getting salvaged out here. And I happened to get there right when they were starting to do that, and it was a great tour. And these guys were great. They showed me how they do this. They basically, these things fill up with water. They draw it up. Water spills out of the screens there, and then if I remember right, this is where they were dropping the fish to actually count them and tally how many fish were captured in that sample. And then what they do with these fish is, and by the way, most of them looked like they didn't do very well at all in that process. They're a lot of them are kind of bloodied up and don't look so good. And kind of flopping around. And then what they do is they take those fish and then they put them in these tanks, and then the tanks, they truck them back out to the delta, and they spill them into this outfall. And my understanding is that there's a lot of big fish there waiting for them. They get an easy snack. The pumps are really interesting because writing about this fish issue, the scientists seem to always be kind of, and it's just my sense, and I got hints of this. I don't know that anybody actually said this, but my sense of where these guys were coming from was, yeah, the pumps do cause problems. They obviously are killing fish and having an impact on fish populations, but again, this is my sense that they didn't really believe that these were the things that were causing that big fish crisis, because, and I'm pretty sure that's because they were, these pumps are so carefully monitored. I mean, they're watching these things and counting the number of fish that are there, and they're just really heavily scrutinized. And I think they didn't really think that the pumps could be causing something that was so surprising to them that they couldn't explain, because they were so heavily scrutinized. But I think that's changing a little bit. I was at the CalFed Science Conference in October, and a guy named Dr. Bill Bennett is the big Delta smelt expert. And he said something to the effect, it's not verbatim, but basically, as I heard him, he said, if you'd asked me a couple of months ago if the pumps were causing this issue, I would have said no, but now I'm not so sure. And the reason he was saying that was because he had developed evidence that not all Delta smelt are created equal. Basically, what he was finding and saying was that the Delta smelt that spawn earliest in the year and the fish that hatch earliest in the year are the strongest and fittest fish of the year. And therefore, those stronger and fitter fish are the ones that are most likely to, kind of run that gauntlet of the summer in a deteriorating delta to survive to the next year. As he said to me when I asked him about it, he said it's like going to the World Series with your minor league. You basically, if the pumps are killing the first spawners, you're selecting out the fish that are most likely to be able to survive. Now, what's interesting is I mentioned that the pumps were curtailed in the spring, and there was more pumping in the fall. Well, apparently, they were also pumping a little bit more earlier in the year, and Dr. Bennett was saying that that's killing the fittest Delta smelt. Which begs a question to me. I mean, I don't have an answer for this, but if you can't pump in the spring because the salmon are having problems, and then you have to offset that by pumping at other times of the year, the quest, and it's just a question, is, well, can you sustainably take that much water out of the delta? Is there a safe time to do it? And I don't know. I mean, I'd like to have somebody answer that for me. And the thing that, and I should say the biologists that were at this conference were really impressed with this. To them, that it kind of made a lot of sense in terms of population dynamics and biology that I guess is a little bit beyond me. But they were impressed with this theory. I was really interested in it for obvious reasons, and also because it recalled a story that I did last year. After I did that first story about all the fish kind of collapsing, I was talking to somebody who, mentioned a couple of things that would make interesting follow-ups. And one of the old cliches in newspapers is, if your mother says she loves you, you better check it out. And so one of the stories I checked out, and it wasn't a story, and I can't remember if it wasn't true or if it just doesn't seem like such a big deal. But the other thing was really interesting, which was that this team of biologists called the Delta Smelt Working Group that was set up under the Endangered Species Act to make recommendations about how best to protect Delta smelt, had made recommendations in January '05 and in May '05 to slow down the pumping, and that didn't happen. So those recommendations are kind of made through this formal process, and you can get the documents. They're notes of conference calls, and so I got those, and then I looked at the website that kind of says here's how much water was pumped on any given day, and they clearly didn't match up. I mean, those recommendations to curtail pumping didn't happen. So I wrote about that, and it was interesting. There was actually that led to a state Senate committee having a hearing, and the Senate committee staff, in the process of having that hearing, they're more interested in California law because that's what they have, authority over, not federal law like the Endangered Species Act. Well, they determined that DWR didn't have permits under the State Endangered Species Act. DWR said, well, we do sort of have they call it a patchwork of compliance, but they don't really clearly, they don't have a very clear permit at the very least. So there's a lawsuit about that now, about whether these pumps are in compliance with state endangered species law. But the whole point of that was that nobody knew it at the time. The biologists didn't know it. I certainly didn't know it. But when those recommendations were made in January '05, they were apparently made, again, with nobody knowing it, that to protect, what turned out to be the most important delta smelt, if, Bill Bennett's right. And I guess if anybody cares about delta smelt, I'm not sure. Okay, did we, was this all seen? Did we see all of this coming? Yeah. In the early 90s, there was a salmon crisis. I was in either Colorado or New Mexico at the time. I wasn't around. But there was a salmon crisis. There was fewer than 200 winter run Chinook salmon going up the Sacramento River in 1992. And there was, as I understand it, kind of chaotic water things going on at the time. There was people, basically orders coming down to, curtail pumping right away when the farmers had their crops in the ground. And that's, for them, that's a big deal. I mean, we just planted our crops, we need our water, and you're shutting it off. So it was chaotic. State and federal governments got together. And in August of 2000, they came up with a plan to address what was going on in the Delta called the ROD, or the Record of Decision. When they signed that, the ROD describes itself, the CalFed program, as I think I got this right, the most ambitious environmental restoration project in the world and the most comprehensive water supply management program in history, simultaneously. I mean, that's a lot. And it was a 30-year, $8.5 billion program. And that series that I did last year was basically saying that to date hasn't done so well. And I wasn't the first one to come to that conclusion by any means. I mean, there was the governor had already ordered, audits, and a little Hoover Commission. And it wasn't just me. But the important thing here is that the ROD says that stage 1 ends a year from now. And that's important. That's why I think next year is going to be so interesting. Bottom line, I mean, CalFed restored salmon habitat. They had some groundwater banking programs that worked. But kind of the delta and the fish, kind of the focal point of this whole thing, was kind of unraveling before its eyes. All right, the ROD said that isolated conveyance facility is kind of another word for peripheral canal, and the ROD said that I know, huh? It's kind of sneak that one right by you. It was technically superior alternative, but politically infeasible. Does that? I mean, if anybody doesn't know what a peripheral canal is, basically it was very divisive. It was going to be part of the state water project. They were going to take water out of the Sacramento River near Sacramento, big canal capable of taking a big chunk of that river around the delta to the pumps. You'd avoid a lot of the levee issues, the water quality issues, if you did it that way. But it was also seen as a big water grab and potentially environmentally destructive. There was a referendum in 1982, and the thing was shot down on the strength of unbelievably strong opposition in Northern California. I looked up the votes for that series, and I think Contra Costa and Alameda counties voted something like 95% against, I think. Really high. I mean, today, if you had a ballot question that says the Pope Catholic, you wouldn't get 95%, I don't think. But the ROD said this is technically the way to go, but politically can't be done. So they decided that they would do what they call through delta conveyance, but they would revisit that decision at the end of stage 1, which is next December. So I think next year is going to be really interesting. There are several things going on. There's something called a Delta Vision, and they're going to kind of take a comprehensive look at all the infrastructure and water supply and land use and all the various things going on in the Delta. And it's the governor formed this thing, and they're going to make some decisions. And one of the big decisions they're going to make is, well, is the Delta going to be the water conveyance for California, or are we going to build something around it? A peripheral canal would avoid a lot of the problems that I talked about, but of course it could create a lot more problems. There's a lot. Contra Costa was really opposed to this last time around because basically, they're left with all the drainage and no, fresh water to wash through here. And there's a lot of it's just going to be an interesting debate. That's the bottom line. We can talk about that more if you want. And I think that's all I got. If you guys have any questions.
Mike, you want to say something about the retirement of times?
Sure.
You have to use that in the process.
Yeah. I couldn't find a place to work that in. Where to start? One of the big water users in the San Joaquin Valley is the Westlands Water District, and they've had problems for years getting the water that they contend that they're entitled to. They also have a very serious drainage issue. There's a clay layer under this district that is, shallow. So as they irrigate, the water table can rise under there, and there is a lot of selenium in that area. Their drainage at one time went to Kesterson National Wildlife Refuge, and in the 1980s, there was that selenium buildup in that refuge caused some really horrific wildlife problems. You had really bad deformities of birds, for example, out there. It was poisoning this refuge. So they clearly couldn't keep doing that. And so Westlands today is left with a water supply problem. They don't get all the water they want or need, and they have a drainage problem. In recent years, Westlands has talked about voluntarily retiring some of its land, I think about 200,000 acres. Basically, they would, I guess the most likely way that would happen would be the government would buy their land for 200,000 acres out of the district. The district's about 600,000 acres. Now, as best I can tell, and I haven't talked to them for a while, but as best I can tell, they don't seem to be as enthusiastic about retiring all that land as they were at one point. Or it may be also that the discussion has gone to more acreage, 300,000 acres. There was recently so the Westlands district had a problem, had a couple of problems. They sued the government and said, because we're part of the Central Valley Project, you have an obligation to not only provide us water, but also provide us drainage. We gotta get this water out of here. The judge agreed with them. They won that case. And so they have, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation now has an obligation to provide them drainage. There's not a lot of really good options. Kesterson didn't work. So the options basically appear to be, build a pipe to Antioch and dump it in the Delta, which is not a very popular idea, especially in Contra Costa. You could build a pipe to Monterey Bay. That's even less popular probably. You can do some in-storage, in-valley evaporation ponds. That might be really expensive, but might be doable. But the other option is land retirement. And I did a story, I think it was this summer, that where the Bureau of Reclamation had in its draft EIS, I think it was a draft EIS, had said basically our preferred option is to retire these 300,000 acres. Westlands at the time said, well, we don't want to do that much. That's too much. But it raises some interesting issues about the future of water use in California, because you've got a big agricultural water user, do they get bought out? And then if they do, what happens to that water? I mean, they would like to keep it in the district because as they see it, they've got a shortage. And by retiring half the district, maybe they can double the water supply for everybody else. So, does that answer your question?
Well, we have ample time, so for questions and comments.
David?
Mike, on the same subject, could you talk a little bit about, I know the Sumner Pact decision that provided for the decision that they had to provide drainage, allowed the litigants to retain their water and to sell it or whatever. And another possible use of Westlands water, if 200,000 or 300,000 acres are retired, would be to sell that water to Contra Costa or Los Angeles or whatever. Do you see a way of retiring that land and returning that water to the public for a decision to be made on helping Delta smelt and helping water supply reliability rather than enriching West Side agriculture?
You got me. I mean, that's a question I would be asking. But I think those are negotiations. I mean, I'm wondering, because the Bureau and Westlands appear to be, they're in negotiations, I think. And so that's the question I have. What happens to that water? And does Westlands keep it? Does it revert back to the public? I just don't know. It appears to me that decision is going to be made, but I don't know how it's going to be made. No idea. I'll go back and forth, maybe.
I was just wondering that whether the concept of public trust came up at all since the reclamation district is bound by the public trust that water rights are subject to public trust, and it would seem that if the use of water injures the public, that there is no right to use that water. And if there is retirement, the matter of compensation, obviously water has been included in the land prices, but for a very short period of time. And is Westlands saying that, what's their argument? Their compensation, and has the public trust even come up? Because it would seem that this would be a key place to do that.
Well, first of all, I should say I haven't talked to them in 6 months, so I don't know I'm familiar with what's going on, but I'm not that close to it. As far as public trust goes, that's a legal question. I don't know. But these aren't water rights, as I understand it. These are, the federal government has the water right, and there's a contract to deliver that to Westlands. And I think the public trust is kind of more, has to do with water rights per se.
But doesn't the Bureau of Reclamation, part section 2, doesn't it say that it has to be consistent with state law?
I don't know about section 2, but yeah, I mean, federal government usually defers to state law, so yeah.
Why aren't they?
I don't know. I mean, public trust is kind of it's a really interesting issue, but it's not something I know a lot about, and frankly, it doesn't come up that often for whatever reason. In California, I guess it did come up when I was in New Mexico. Yeah.
As a layperson, I have layperson in the sense of law and policy. I have always been intrigued that whenever this Bureau of Reclamation wrote contracts with various water users and districts, in principle they seem to have written these contracts for 50 years or 60 years or 100 years even. But when that time period ends, normally one would imagine that everything would be off, and then based on new sets of conditions, and the earth is changing, the environment is changing, that the agency would have the privilege of looking at the conditions afresh and then see what's the best way, the beneficial way of using the water. However, that seems to be not happening. Somehow there seems to be a legal argument one way or the other to treat as if these contracts which are signed for 40 years or 50 years are in fact contracts in perpetuity. That the renewal of the contract should be automatic. I mean, to me as a layperson it doesn't make sense, but that seems to be the way the legal system works.
And the policy.
Especially nowadays, as scientific knowledge accumulates about these systems and their finiteness and that all the interconnections that we have, science is really at a quantum. If you want to use a mathematical language, these are all a bunch of nonlinear coupled equations. And we don't, mathematics say that we don't know that a solution exists for these systems. And if a solution exists, whether it is unique, we do not know. But still, we do not want to recognize that. And science wants to be selectively used for certain purposes. And what science does in other ways, we don't want to use it. And so this goes beyond a technical science issue. It's a really a human issue.
Politics.
It's a journalism issue. Doesn't
You want me to do a story on public trust, don't you?
Can you comment a little on the governor's firing of the reclamation board and also the never-ending housing development in the Delta?
The Lathrop development, the River Islands?
Yeah, that's the biggest one.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was a pretty interesting story for us. I mean, the governor, basically you have a reclamation board, you know, the big flood control agency in California was starting to assert itself. One of the members, by the way, was Jeff Mount, who was one of the scientists that wrote the paper that said that there's a 2 in 3 chance of catastrophic failures of levees in the Delta. He and the other board members were asserting themselves with respect to development and land use in the Delta, angering developers. Coincidence or not, the governor fired them all and renamed people that were clearly more pro-development. You know, and I don't know what's on the governor's mind. I mean, that was a big win for developers. And you know, that side of where the governor's coming from. The governor's also been pretty proactive on environmental issues and levees. So it seems a little at odds with some of the other things that he's done. But in the meantime, you've got, for example, the I guess it would be the South Delta near the town of Lathrop, a project called River Islands that, if I remember right, is 11,000 units. And it wasn't going anywhere with the old board. The new board's pretty much approved it. And I think they still need some more approvals. But it's been several months since I checked in and wrote about that. But they may need another. They may be coming before the reclamation board 1 or 2 more times. But so far they've gotten what they've wanted from that board. So it's interesting. I mean, the whole question of land use in the Delta is really interesting. You know, the way the system works now, you know, those fragile levees, they can flood farmland. That kind of relieves pressure upstream. I mean, if there's a lot of water coming down and this levee breaks, you know, the water level kind of goes down and you reduce the threat upstream. As these other levees get hardened, you know, with maybe houses behind them, you know, you have water backing up a little bit more and more pressure on the other levees. So that's going to be a big question for I don't know how long. So, yeah.
How does Southern California fit into this? As I understand, the Westland water is actually the emergency water supply for districts in Southern California, though they haven't had to use it. Now with more conservation and more drawing out of the climate, how is this in fact working out?
I mean, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, when the water water is allocated to Westlands, it was also allocated as an emergency supply to various cities in Southern California. This is when they built that in the pumping station over the Hatcheties. As it's worked out, the Southern California does not need the water. But they could conceivably need it, and so then they would be able to take that water, whether it's given to Westlands or given to some other use.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that. I mean, I've always kind of been under the impression that, you know, the urbans are going to get their water. I mean, and if the farmers have to do a year without, that's going to happen one way or the other. You know, whether they're actually bought out and it's a win-win, or whether, you know, if in a really bad crisis, you know, the water's going to go to where the votes are, I think, and, you know, the farmers, they can replant next year. I mean, I think that's just kind of reality in an extreme situation. And I don't mean that as callous towards farmers. I just think that's the way it would work out.
My colleague has a question, but I have one too, so I'm going to slip to it here, okay? He'd like to know if there's an explanation, if the pumps have been there that long pumping, and yet the fish are only crashing in the last couple of years, is there an explanation for that? And my question is, you mentioned this Delta Vision Group, and I'm wondering who's on that.
Okay, the second question is easy because I don't know. There's they've just named an executive director. There is a committee. Somebody else here probably does know, huh? He resigned? I heard he didn't show up to the first meeting. Is that right? Okay. Huh?
It's in shambles.
Okay, well, they've only had one meeting, so it didn't go so well, I guess. All right, so nobody, apparently. The governor is going to be naming a blue ribbon commission, you know, with people, and that'll be kind of the next interesting thing. Yeah, okay, yeah. The pumps, well, the pumps have been having an impact since they've been there. I mean, and the fish populations have been kind of, in real general terms, slowly going down. What happened beginning in 2002 is they really took a drop. They went over the cliff a little bit. So they've been there. They've been having an impact. Everybody knows that. The question was, well, are they having the really big impact that's causing this really big crisis? And there isn't any clear evidence that that's the case. Although, you know, after Bill Bennett's talk last month, I mean, they're implicated in maybe an indirect way or something like that. Yeah.
What are the consequences of the issues in the recent election on the future of the water problems?
Are you talking about the propositions, the bond measures? Well, that's interesting. I mean, I can tell you what I know, which is, you know, will only be a partial answer. But the levy, Prop 1E, was $4.1 billion. And that's going to go, as I understand it, mostly towards protecting kind of more upstream of the Delta, you know, where you got houses and you're trying to protect lives. But there will be some that will go into the Delta to try to stabilize it. Prop 84, the big Parks and Water bond, that's going to have money for water quality. Contra Costa Water District will probably get some money from that to build an intake in a better location. I think how, especially the Prop 1E money gets divided up is going to be really interesting to watch because, you know, legislators are going to want some, you know, and I don't know how they're going to get it. There's not a real clear plan right now. You know, nobody has said, you know, here's what our priorities are going to be in a real detailed way, you know, and here's how that money ought to be spent, and here's what California's flood control policies are going to be, and here's how we're going to apply that money to make those things work. Now, there are some lawmakers that are trying to put those kinds of policies together and introduce legislation to do that. They haven't been successful yet. But to me, that's going to be interesting. I mean, does that money get spent? I know I talked to one of the developer groups, and to them it makes sense to use that money to match with their money. So in other words, if I'm a developer and I want to build in what's now, a floodplain, but I'm going to improve those levees so that area won't flood anymore, and I'll put up some money, but I'd like to get some of that bond money too to offset that cost. Whether that's going to be allowed or not is going to be, I think, a really interesting question. From one point of view, you're addressing flood issues. I mean, that particular area is going to be less likely to flood now, and you're boosting the public money by matching it with private resources. On the other hand, you're subsidizing development in potentially inappropriate places. So that's going to be a good debate. Yeah.
As the CalFed process played out in an effort to resolve some of these problems that you've identified, there was a fair amount of consensus on some points, but one of the most divisive issues was the one of off-stream storage and how that played in the environmentalists on one side and both the ag and urban users on the other. From your perspective as a journalist, could you talk a little bit about that part of the debate and whether you see any emerging consensus as to that previously contentious issue?
The one I tried to totally skip. Boy, get myself in trouble. You're talking about this, right, the surface storage. What happened to surface storage? There's 5 projects in CalFed. Again, coming back to Contra Costa, they've got a proposal to expand Los Vaqueros Reservoir, which is an off-stream site, as a water quality benefit for the bay. That one seems to be the farthest along, and the water district had an up or down vote on it. Not an up or down vote on it. It was basically a, should we continue to proceed on this and look at doing this project? And it got public support. I mean, the voters of that district said, yeah, we should take a look at this. So that project has that going for it, local support, which is a big thing. Other places like up in, not Shasta, the other one, Sites, I mean, there appears to be some local opposition there, so that's, it's a big hurdle to cross if you're a guy that's planning surface storage for California. Well, how are we going to, deal with that? Another one was the Delta Wetlands project, was just to flood some islands in the Delta. That seems to be, actually did a story about them trying to sell water to Las Vegas out of the Delta, basically by exchanging it with the Met. They went down to Las Vegas when, Las Vegas was really thirsty. They still are a bit. And said, hey, how about we sell Delta water to you, we'll deliver it to the Met in Los Angeles. In exchange, you take the Met's Colorado River water, in equal amounts. And the Met had no interest in that at all, obviously, and it didn't go anywhere. But to me, that was kind of like, well, that project's in trouble. I mean, if that's how far afield they've got to go. And then the others are San Joaquin and raising Shasta. I mean, the bottom line for all of those things, I think, is not just environmental opposition if they have it, which I guess they would in most of those, but who's going to pay for it? I mean, that's the bottom line is, the CalFed was founded on this idea of the user or the beneficiary pays. And so how do you identify the beneficiaries of these projects and get them to pay? And that's a really interesting question is, because that's how you define the project. Here's what this project is. It's a water quality project or storage or flood control or water supply. When you say water supply, that means people, farm districts and urban districts have to pony up the money if the beneficiary pays. The other ones are more inclusive, and you can maybe get a broader base of support to pay for it, like bond money and taxpayer money. Does that answer your question? Is that what you're getting at? Okay. Yeah.
How does the defeat of Congressman Richard Pombo factor into all of this?
That's a good question. Pombo, he's an interesting guy. He was the chairman of the House Resources Committee, right? So he had direct jurisdiction over CalFed, the Bureau of Reclamation, CalFed, and all these things. But his interests are his interests are sort of more national. I mean, he's more interested in, drilling in Alaska and reforming the Endangered Species Act. He did, well, that's shortchanging him a little bit because he did, was pivotal in a reauthorization bill for CalFed. So he and Feinstein got that done. He did have some hearings when this crisis happened. He came out and he had a field hearing. But it wasn't, the fish issue wasn't a high priority for him, I don't think. Levees, maybe they were. I mean, he did do some stuff with levees. And in that position, of resources chair, he had some sway. And I mean, the CalFed reauthorization, CalFed continued in large part with federal participation because of PAMBA. But what that does now, I haven't even thought about that, but that's an interesting question. I mean, he's a really interesting guy. I mean, chairman of the Resources Committee, right here, he's obviously very conservative. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question, though. I'm sorry. Anybody else? Yeah.
So you've worked in a couple of different states, and you've seen the way science mixes with politics. How does the mix here compare with some other places? Does politics usually trump more?
Politics trumps everywhere, I think. But it is interesting. I was lucky, I think, to work in, especially New Mexico before I came here, because there, the landscape is bare. Things are just kind of laid out for you. They're clear cut, and it was a lot easier to understand water controversies and endangered species issues when in that kind of an environment. California is so much more complicated. I mean, when I was in New Mexico, I had most of my sources' phone numbers memorized. I mean, there wasn't that many people. It was very cut and dry where people came down on different issues. Interestingly enough, I did a lot of writing about the Rio Grande and the silvery minnow, so I always feel like it's water and these little fish that nobody care about that I'm writing about, and I care about, because it's interesting. But there, it was just very cut and dried where people lined up. People were in camps. And California, there's just so many more people. The issues are so much more complicated that's the big difference I see. And then if you're getting at, does California tend to be more come down on the environment or water users' sides? I'm not sure. I would say probably environmentalists have more clout in California than they did in New Mexico. But a lot of these things get decided basically on federal law, and the Endangered Species Act. So I'm not sure. I think in New Mexico probably the water users. I mean, it's a whole other topic. I mean, it's such an old place. I mean, in the historical roots, and it's just so much history and stuff there that those water users, that's you don't mess with it, So, did you see the Milagro Beanfield War? It was a great movie, a great book too.
Talking about that one, why do you think the state of California seems ill-prepared to defend its public rights?
Well, I don't know that it is.
They haven't stood up for the public trust.
Well, that's not the same as saying they don't stand up. I mean, public trust is an interesting legal concept, and I don't understand it. So I think it's interesting, but that's, the bottom. What you're getting at is, I think, in-stream flows and kind of public values for water in those things. I wouldn't say that they're unprotected. I mean, you're talking about a tool that can be used to protect them that isn't being used apparently.
Well,
but
like often,
Why hasn't he taken up the public trust doctrine and said we need more water for?
Defending, there's all sorts of trustees, for example, that are designated, and nobody seems to say, hey, we're trustees.
You got me. Yeah, you got me. Yeah. I'm stumped.
Any other questions? Nothing else?
Okay. Well, it was fun and it was weird. It was kind of interesting to be asked questions by people who I usually ask.